KTRG Television presents Conservatively Speaking with your moderator, Chuck Brooks.
Good evening. Our guest tonight is Mrs. Phyllis Schlafly. Mrs. Schlafly is a Phi Beta Kappa with a master's degree in political science from Radcliffe College. She is the author of the book A Choice, Not an Echo, and the co-author, along with Rear Admiral Chester Ward, of The Gravediggers and Strike from Space. Mrs. Schlafly was voted in 1964 the award of the St. Louis Globe Democrat, Woman of Outstanding Achievement in Public Affairs. She is also the mother of 6 and an expert on the foreign policy, national defense, national strategy, and the question of disarmament in the United States. Mrs. Schlafly, if I may begin by asking you this question. In 1945, at the end of the Second World War, the United States had a position of unrivaled supremacy in the world. We had perfected the atomic bomb, we had developed a great many weapon systems, we had a high developed economy, and we were respected by our enemies, loved by our friends, admired by the emerging people of the world at that time. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, was seriously bloodied by the Second World War, had perfected no new weapon systems, had even had difficulty in subduing tiny Finland in the Second World War. And yet today, the United States and the Soviet Union, vis-a-vis one another, seem to be reversing their roles. The Soviet Union seems to be more of a powerful country than the United States, at least as far as defense is concerned. How do you account for this transformation?
Well, Chuck, you put your finger on exactly the problem which we face today. In World War II, our country was able to beat 2 of the great military powers of the world, Germany and Japan, fighting on 2 fronts. And today, here we are engaged in a little war in Vietnam, fighting not a second-rate power, not a third-rate power, but a 30th-rate power. 1/2 of a poor little underdeveloped, unindustrialized country. The war goes on, month after month. We put more and more men in. We increase our numbers every month. And the best that Secretary McNamara can say is that we are no longer losing. How did it happen that we are in this position? And why is it that we can't bring the war to a speedy conclusion and save the lives of all those Americans?
Well, everyone says that we can win the war readily in Vietnam. Why aren't we doing so?
Well, that's right. The Secretary or the head of our Air Force, General McConnell, said that the war in Vietnam could be won overnight. And when asked what he meant by overnight, he said in a matter of 2 or 3 weeks. The head of our Navy in the Pacific said that the 7th Fleet could win in a day or 2 if given the right orders. And everybody knows that the big percentage of the weapons and supplies that are killing American boys come in from the Soviets by water and through the port of Haiphong. Everybody says that if we would just blockade the harbor, mine the harbor, knock out the dredges there, bomb the so-called expensive targets in North Vietnam, we could bring the war to a speedy conclusion. And we could save all this blood, sweat, and tears. And then in addition to the saving in lives and money, there are such obvious political advantages to bringing the war to a speedy conclusion. As everybody knows, the President would like to get the war out of the way in the far in advance of the '68 elections. So why don't they go ahead and win quickly in Vietnam? Well, this is a question that I've given a lot of thought to. And when you ask some of our military men why we don't do it, they will say, first of all, that's a political question, a matter of policy, and they can't express themselves. But when you press them privately, they will say, we don't want to have a confrontation with the Soviet Union. We don't want to run any risk of nuclear war, of World War III. Well, now, let's examine this question of being afraid of a confrontation with the Soviet Union, of being afraid of nuclear war. What does this mean? If we're afraid of nuclear war with the Soviet Union, that must mean we're afraid of the Soviet Union attacking us with nuclear weapons. And so, because we don't want to risk this, we are offering up as hostages the lives of 11,000 American boys who are now killed every year in Vietnam, and 30,000 casualties a year. There's a little story that President Johnson had been telling off the record for many months, and it only broke into print rather recently. He told this story in reference to his daughter Lucy. He said that last year, one day, he gave the order to bomb some of the petroleum depots in North Vietnam. And once he gave the order, he began to worry, and to worry that maybe he had pulled the trigger for World War III. And he talked to his daughter Lucy, and he expressed these worries and these doubts. And he said to Lucy, maybe I've given the order that will bring about a nuclear attack on the United States. Maybe our country will be incinerated. And then he said to Lucy, you may not wake up tomorrow morning. And this shook Lucy, as it would shake anybody. And at that point, she suggested that they go together to the Church of the Little Monks and pray that his fears would not come true. So they did. Now, examining this little story, which are the words out of President Johnson's own mouth, I think it reveals quite a lot. President Johnson might do a lot of things that many of us don't approve of, but I don't believe that he would deliberately terrorize his daughter Lucy. I think he loves Lucy. And I don't think that any father would deliberately, willfully frighten and terrorize his daughter into saying, you may not wake up tomorrow morning. So I think this was a genuine fear on his part. Now this proves that he has no faith that our country can defend itself against a nuclear attack. It proves he has no faith in McNamara's statements to Congress that we have the Soviets deterred. And it also proves why we don't win in Vietnam. Because if we were safe, if we had the defense and the superiority that we had when President Johnson and McNamara took office, we wouldn't need to worry about winning in Vietnam. We wouldn't need to worry that bombing a few little old petroleum depots in North Vietnam would bring about a Soviet attack on the United States.
Mrs. Schlafly, I know you're familiar with the book, Protracted Conflict. In that book, the argument is made that there are two zones in the world, the peace zone and the war zone. All activity of a warlike nature must occur in the war zone, and the war zone is always the free world's zone. It appears to me that if the communists begin an altercation somewhere in Lebanon or in the Near East or somewhere in the Congo or Southeast Asia, it does not precipitate World War III, but any counteraction on our part will, the argument runs, bring about nuclear holocaust. Now what does this due to? Is it due to some kind of a psychological guilt complex or urge to suicide on our own people or our own officials, or what?
Well, this is the way that they pull the psychological warfare on us. You know, we see a local example of this in Vietnam, where they hit all the targets in South Vietnam. They call that the war zone. But we don't hit the targets in North Vietnam. They hit Saigon, but we're afraid to hit Hanoi. They commit every kind of attack on us, but we don't hit back. There's another aspect to this thing, and that is that with these incidents that the Soviets start and get us involved in, what this accomplishes is to get us building up our defense in foot soldiers, in ammunition, in rifles, in machine guns, and in the kind of weapons that you use to fight in Vietnam or these little trouble spots around the world. And then the American people don't realize that this is money diverted away from the nuclear weapons that we need for the protection of our country. And in the book that I co-authored with Admiral Ward, Strike from Space, we showed that the principal purpose of bogging us down in Vietnam is to get us spending these fantastic sums, now $30 billion a year, on Vietnam, and this is money which is taken away from the spending on our missiles, the Nike X anti-missile, the strategic bombers, space weapons, and the other things that we need to protect our homeland. Now, after all, we want to win in Vietnam, and we're in there and we ought to win. But the most important thing is to make sure that you and I and 200 million Americans are safe in our homes against the terror of a nuclear attack. And this is why many people don't realize that while the defense budget has climbed up and up, the spending on the weapons that we need to protect us here in America has gone down more than 40%, and the weapons are simply not being built.
You say that the purpose of the Vietnamese War is to get us involved in a conventional war rather than a nuclear one. Whose purpose is
The
this?
Soviet purpose, and it was the Soviets who trapped us into fighting in combat with American boys in Vietnam. It is the Soviets who have prevented the other side from accepting any kind of peace offer. It is the Soviets today who are supplying more than 90% of the weapons, the equipment, which is killing American boys. They are the ones who are sending in these wonderful new surface-to-surface missiles, the new heavy artillery, and the marvelous anti-aircraft weapons. These are Soviet weapons that are killing American boys. They're experimenting on them, they're testing them, and they're keeping us fighting there, while we're putting in more men and tying their hands and not permitting them to go ahead for victory.
We'll be right back in just a moment.
We'll be back in just a moment with more of Conservatively Speaking. Now let's return to Conservatively Speaking. Here's your host, Chuck Brooks.
Mrs. Schlafly, what precisely do you mean that we do not have the nuclear weapons to fight a nuclear war with the Soviet Union?
Well, this is the most important subject that we have to discuss today. And I have here with me a chart which gives the answer to your question. Now, let's examine this chart, which shows the megatonnage delivery capability. Now, when I say megatonnage, this is the measure of firepower in the nuclear age. Here you will see that in 1962, the United States had up to 50,000 megatons of nuclear striking power. This was the great shield that protected us at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. You remember in the last nick of time, the U-2 flight discovered the missiles that were there. And then our great Strategic Air Command went on alert, and this was the 50,000 megatons that protected us against the Cuban missiles. At that time, the Soviet Union had only 5 to 10 megatons of nuclear striking power.
5 to 10,000.
5 to 10,000 megatons of nuclear striking power. In other words, we had up to a 10-to-1 lead over the Soviet Union. And that was why they didn't dare to fire those missiles. Now you will see that as the years moved along, what has happened to the nuclear strength of our country. It has come down, down, down to here is where we are in mid-1967. And under the policies which have already been established and announced by Secretary McNamara it will continue down, down, down until by 1971 we will have something between 5 and 15,000 megatons of nuclear striking power. Now, meanwhile, look at what has happened to the Soviet capability. Here they started, pitiful in comparison to the United States, and they have come up, 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 till here at the present time they have crossed over. In early 1967, the Soviets crossed over and are now superior to the United States in megatonnage delivery capability. That is, in the firepower that it takes to do the job in the nuclear age. And they are projected up to 50,000 megatons in 1971. Now, by the time we reach this 4 years hence, they will have a 10-to-1 lead over us. In other words, in the span of time from 1962 to 1971, our positions will be exactly reversed. This is the big X in your life. You will see here is the Soviet plan for the conquest of the world, building up its nuclear megatonnage from 5,000 to 50,000 megatons. And here is the McNamara plan to disarm our country, reducing and scrapping our strength from 50,000 down to 5,000. And this year of 1967 is the crossover year. It is a great shock to most Americans to realize we are no longer tops in the kind of weapons that it takes to survive in the nuclear age. Now, this chart was made and released very recently by a very distinguished group of some of our most respected military men, including General Bernard Schriever, who was head of our missile command. He was the chairman of the committee. And it included General LeMay, who was former Chief of Staff of the Air Force, General Power, who was head of the Strategic Air Command, and many other distinguished military lights in our country today. They issued this report, which showed exactly what has happened to the nuclear strength of our country, and it is shocking. It made the front pages of the newspapers in our country today, and it came out in a report which was issued for the benefit of the House Armed Services Committee. This report, which is called The Changing Strategic Military Balance, spells out chapter and verse of exactly how this dismantling of our nuclear strength has taken place. For example, you may be interested in the page on the intercontinental ballistic missiles. And they show that although we have quite a few missiles, the Soviet missiles are a great deal more powerful. And it is the megatonnage which is the measure of firepower in the nuclear age.
Well, isn't this the question of overkill? What is important about having more megatons? As long as you have a missile that hits a target and won't destroy as much territory as a heavier yield weapon?
Overkill is a very interesting thing. You know, during World War II, I was a gunner in the largest ammunition plant in the world. And we made enough ammunition there to put about 6 bullets in every man, woman, and child in the Axis powers. Now, what do you need all that ammunition for? Only 1 bullet can kill a man, and we didn't intend to kill every man, woman, and child anyway. But you need overkill, because some of it is used in testing, some in training, some is in transit. Once you fire them, they don't all reach their targets. Some of it misfires. And there are many other reasons why you need overkill in order to make sure that when the crisis is there, the one weapon reaches its target at the right time. Now, we know that the Soviets have been building and deploying their own anti-missile system for at least 3 years. This is why we need overkill, to make sure we can get through their missile defenses and reach the targets if we are going to protect ourselves. Now, another one of the charts is on the intermediate range missiles. McNamara has scrapped all of ours and given up the bases in Turkey and Italy from which they could be fired.
He stated that those bases were already outdated, that they weren't of any use to our defense.
Well, this is his favorite expression. He tells us things are obsolete, and so he scraps things, but he doesn't replace it with anything else. So he tells us they're obsolete and gets rid of it, but then there's no replacement. And then there is the matter of the space weapon. Now you know that the Soviets have their space weapon, the Scrag, which carries a 30 megaton warhead. And incidentally, that is the weapon which is shown on the cover of our book, Strike from Space. We have no space weapon at all. McNamara simply doesn't think that's important, but the Soviets do, and you can just imagine what that would mean if the Soviets would hang their Scrag in orbit over the United States and now say, surrender by 2 p.m. this afternoon, or we can destroy a big part of your country.
But didn't we sign a treaty with the Soviet Union saying there cannot be any orbital weapons in outer space?
Well, I hope that makes you feel good to know that the Soviets signed a treaty that said that. Of course, you're talking about a country that has broken its treaties with every country to which it ever gave a signed agreement.
Well, we also had the treaty of the Moscow Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of 1958, which the Soviets broke in 1963. And John Kennedy, the President of the United States, said at that time that the Soviet Union prepared to test nuclear weapons while we were at the table negotiating with them. If they fooled us once, it is their fault. If they fool us twice, it is our fault. Again, Mr. Kennedy said on March 2nd, 1962, we know enough about broken negotiations, secret preparations, and the Soviet advantages gained from a long test series never to offer again an uninspected moratorium. Is it your contention, then, that we are being fooled twice by the Soviets and that we are engaging in uninspected moratoriums and signing these treaties with the Soviets?
That statement you read from President Kennedy is just absolutely great. It's too bad he didn't carry out what he said in that statement, because he came right back in 1963 and presented our country with an uninspected agreement with the Soviets, namely the Moscow Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, negotiated by Averell Harriman and signed by Kennedy and Khrushchev. Now, when our Senate held hearings on this treaty, the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff made one of the most important statements about American defense ever made by anyone on active duty in our country. And they said that the Soviet Union was then, that is in 1963, ahead of the United States in the high-yield nuclear weapons, and ahead of us in weapons effect knowledge, in other words, what we know about the weapons. And thirdly, that they were ahead of us in the yield-weight ratio, that is, how much bang you get out of a given amount of nuclear explosive. And they further said that that test ban treaty would freeze us in second place. The Senate ignored the warning of our Joint Chiefs and signed the treaty. And this is one of the things that contributes to this chart we pointed out earlier, which shows how the strength of our country has come down under the McNamara policies. It shows why we're not able to continue with the strength we had. We can't test the weapons that we need. At the same time that we know that the Soviets, in their wonderful giant tests in 1961 and 2, learned so much that we don't know. For example, one of them is the X-ray effect, which is one of the effects of these big super megaton weapons that the Soviets have. And we now know that they are 2 or 3 years ahead of us in the use of this X-ray effect.
In one of your books entitled The Grave Diggers, you comment very unfavorably on some documents entitled the Liberal Papers, the Phoenix Papers, and a State Department document 7277 entitled Freedom from War, the United States Program for General and Complete Disarmament in a Peaceful World. Don't you think that disarmament is a noble idea, that we should work for disarmament, considering the great firepower possessed in the world today?
Well, do you think it's a noble objective to abolish the police in our cities and to say people ought to be good guys and live in peace and harmony? It's ridiculous for us to have police.
Wouldn't work in Detroit, would it?
No, it certainly wouldn't. And I operate from the premise that there are bad guys in the world, and there will always be. And it's up to decent, respectable, civilized people to protect us from them. Now, there are bad guys in the Kremlin. Most people don't know how bad those men are. They think, oh, they wouldn't do such a thing. I think the men in the Kremlin should be compared to Richard Speck. Do you remember he was that criminal in Chicago who murdered those 8 nurses? Coolly, systematically, methodically, sadistically. Most of us can't understand how anybody could be so depraved as to do such a terrible crime. Now, the way Richard Speck looked at those 8 nurses is just the way the men in the Kremlin look at the United States of America. They'd like to get rid of us in the same way, coolly, and without any emotion, because they want to conquer the world, and we're the #1 target standing in their way.
Well, if the United States then is disarming itself and disarming itself unilaterally, what is the attitude of our people in the Congress and the Pentagon, the War Department, and everywhere else in response to this? Is it only Mr. McNamara who's bringing about this situation we see today?
McNamara is the principal one who is carrying out these ideas. You mentioned earlier the State Department publication and some of these other way-out disarmament studies. McNamara carries them out, but he has surrounded himself with a whole group of these men I call the gravediggers. They are the ones who are trying to disarm us. They are men like now his Deputy Secretary of Defense, Paul Nitze, his Secretary of the Air Force, Harold Brown, Dr. Walt Rostow, who is the President's Chief Foreign Policy Advisor, Dr. Jerome Wiesner, who is a principal advocate of disarmament. And these men have built a whole ideology that goes along the line that we just have to disarm ourselves first and hope that the Soviets will do the same thing after we do. And we hope that they'll be good guys. And we hope they won't commit this final act of destruction. Now, I think this is wishful thinking at its best. And what we must do is to make sure that we have the military hardware that it takes in the nuclear age so that we don't have to depend on what we hope the Soviets will do or any hope that they'll reform, but we've got the stuff that it takes to defend ourselves.
Fine. We'll be right back in just a moment.
We'll be back in just a moment with more of Conservatively Speaking. Now let's return to Conservatively Speaking. Here's your host, Chuck Brooks.
Our guest is Mrs. Phyllis Schlafly. She's speaking on the question of disarmament. Mrs. Schlafly, surely if the Soviet Union were to attack us today, we would be able to defend ourselves and retaliate against them. And because of this deterrent effect that we do possess, they probably wouldn't start an attack, would they?
Oh, Chuck, you just expressed the view that probably most Americans have, but it just isn't so. What many people don't realize is that if the Soviets should attack us today, we have absolutely nothing to shoot down their missiles with. All that our gigantic Defense Department could do would be to give you 15 minutes warning to go hide in the basement if you think that's going to do any good. Now, American technological genius has developed a very wonderful weapon which can give us the sure protection that we need. It's called the Nike X anti-missile. And this weapon can do exactly what we need. It can go out into space. It can kill the enemy missile before it kills us. This Nike X anti-missile has been unanimously recommended by the Joint Chiefs of Staff for more than 2 years. Congress wants it and has so indicated in overwhelming votes.
Well, isn't it prohibitive in its cost, this particular weapon system?
Oh, that's McNamara's argument. You see, he's the principal reason why we don't have it. And this is what McNamara says. He claims that it isn't cost-effective because our damage-limiting system costs more than enemy offensive system. In other words, what he's saying is it costs us more to build the anti-missile than it costs the Soviets to build the missile, more missiles. Therefore, it isn't cost-effective. Now, I think this is a typical egghead argument that's full of big words but lacking in common sense. Just because it costs us more to maintain fire departments than it costs the arsonist to buy matches and gasoline, this is no argument for not having fire departments.
But isn't it a little provocative to build this system? It sounds like it's a warlike act.
Well,
using Mr. McNamara's argument.
Yes, and that's also Mr. Wiesner's argument, who was the chairman of the White House committee that said we shouldn't have it. That line of argument goes like this. They say if we build the anti-missile, this will make the Soviets think we're not peace-loving. And then they will be provoked into being more belligerent than they are. Well, again, this is one of these egghead arguments that is lacking in common sense. There is nothing provocative about the Nike X anti-missile. It is purely defensive. It cannot kill a single Russian. It cannot kill a single Viet Cong. Only thing it can kill is an enemy missile after it's already in space coming toward us with its destructive warhead. And therefore it is it is defensive as a burglar alarm system is defensive. It doesn't go into effect unless and until the enemy is on the premises doing his dirty work. And anyway, the Soviets have already started to build and deploy their anti-missile system. You know, Admiral Ward and I revealed this in the first edition of Strike from Space, which came out in 1965, and Secretary McNamara didn't discover it till November of '66. But he now admits that the Soviets are building their anti-missile system. But he still says he doesn't want us to have it. And I believe that the Nike X anti-missile is the single most important weapon that we need. So in case there is any enemy attack, we can shoot down their missiles and provide a shield around our country which can give us the freedom and peace that we need to survive in the nuclear age.
Secretary of Defense McNamara also did not realize that there were offensive missiles in Cuba until several months after Senator Keating had stated so. You subtitled Strike from Space, your book with Admiral Ward, a megadeath mystery. What precisely did you mean by that, a megadeath mystery?
Megadeath is a Pentagon word meaning 1,000,000 deaths. And what we have to realize is the enormous destructive power of these nuclear weapons. We're not just talking about killing of tens of thousands. We're talking about the killing of hundreds of millions. And one of the senior men on the Atomic Energy Commission in Congress, the Congressional Atomic Energy Committee, is Craig Hosmer. And he recently put out a scenario which would show just exactly what would happen in the case of a Soviet attack. And he showed a map which tells how 18 of the 100 megaton Soviet warheads that we know they possess, and incidentally we do not possess them, could hit our country in one massive attack and would, through these fireballs rolling across our country, destroy and kill 3 out of every 5 Americans. He describes in detail exactly how such an attack would occur. And then he has a terse little comment at the end where one lone survivor said, I guess Secretary of Defense McNamara miscalculated. As you pointed out a few minutes ago, he miscalculated about Khrushchev sending his missiles into Cuba. He also miscalculated about the Bay of Pigs. And he's miscalculated in every major decision connected with Vietnam. So we as Americans are in a position of making this kind of a choice. Do we want to put our security, our chance for our children to grow up in a wonderful country in the hands of a man whose judgment has been wrong in every major issue? Or instead, do we want to have the hardware to protect us even if he is wrong?
How many lives do you figure could be saved in a nuclear attack if we employed the Nike X system?
Secretary McNamara concedes that the Nike X anti-missile would save between 70 and 90 million American lives. In effect, he says, well, if you can only save 70 to 90 million, why save any? I don't look upon it that way. You and I might be one of the 70 to 90 million saved. Personally, I believe he put the figure as low as he possibly could, and that the Nike X anti-missile would in fact save all Americans because it would deter a Soviet attack. In other words, the Soviets don't want to become involved in any prolonged war or interchange of weapons between the United States and the Soviet Union. This opens them up to revolt behind the Iron Curtain or anything else. The only way they would attack would be if they felt they could effectively assassinate 3/4 or 3/5 of our people in one blow. Now, this is what their super megaton bombs give them the capability of doing. And this is what we have to protect ourselves against. And if by the anti-missile system we could say, we could show that, well, even if you attacked, we would still, you could only kill a small number of our people, then in my opinion and my analysis of Soviet objectives, they wouldn't do it at all.
It appears to me that so many people who are formulating this particular disarmament policy would likewise be killed in any nuclear war. How, therefore, can they support nuclear disarmament on the part of the United States? James Burnham, writing in his book Suicide of the West, stated that liberalism is the ideology of Western suicide. What does that mean precisely for all the rest of us who are not liberals?
Well, what it means, I think, was most clearly illustrated in the actual words from the man who is now our Deputy Secretary of Defense, Paul Nitze. He has risen from one job to another so that now he's second only to McNamara. Now, a number of years ago, he made a speech in which he laid out this liberal, or as I call it, gravedigger ideology about disarming our country. What he said was, the most dangerous hand to have if you are playing a game of poker is the second best hand. Because if your hand is second best, you think it's pretty good, and you bid on, and eventually you get clobbered. Now, a woman would never use an analogy like this, but being a man and talking to men, he used this poker analogy, and he applied it to the defense of our country. And he said, therefore, it's most dangerous for us to be second best to the Soviets in the arms race. It's much safer if we disarm ourselves so completely that the Soviets will feel they do not need to attack. And therefore you refer again to this chart, and you see that that is exactly what they've done. And they feel that it's very dangerous right now when we are close to the Soviet Union, but second best as we are right now. And their plan is to carry out the disarmament of our country to where we are so weak and the Soviets so strong that they'll feel they don't need to attack, and they will accept some kind of negotiated surrender. This line down here is the gravedigger's plan to disarm our country. And this is the line which shows the Soviet plan to conquer the world. When they're up here and we're down here, who will control the world? It's the one with the nuclear weapons, the Soviets. And I think these men hope that the Soviets will accept some kind of a negotiated arrangement in place of attack. But one way or the other, it means the loss of American freedom, and the answer is still open to us, and will be for a short time. We can rebuild the nuclear strength of our country. We can build the Nike X anti-missile, which when we add to it the X-ray effect, can give us a wonderful shield against any missile attack and make ourselves safe.
Clemenceau, the French premier once stated that war is too important to be left to the generals, which is about as silly as saying that peace is too important to be left to the politicians. Would you say that the military supports in any measurable way Mr. McNamara's plans for the unilateral disarmament of the United States?
The military doesn't support in any way at all any of these McNamara programs. What McNamara has done is to put a whole bunch of these civilians in control of the military so that these civilian whiz kids, as he calls them, are the ones making the decisions. You find just recently the head of the Joint Chiefs testified before Congress and made it very clear that they are utterly opposed to the McNamara refusal to build the anti-missile. The Joint Chiefs are unanimously in favor of it, and they've come right out and said so. And I might say that in saying so, they put their careers on the line, because McNamara has quite a record of banishing to Okinawa or other faraway places the men in the military who dare to disagree with him.
Well, that's the question of muzzling of the military, and we can get back to that in just a moment.
We'll be back in just a moment with more of Conservatively Speaking. Now let's return to Conservatively Speaking. Here's your host, Chuck Brooks.
Mrs. Schlafly, does this chart really confirm what you and Admiral Ward had said in Strike from Space?
It certainly does, Chuck. We came out with these figures in the fall of 1965, and this new report, which is issued by General Schriever and other top men, has confirmed in every detail what we described as the McNamara policy. It's even confirmed all of our figures.
Back to this question of the muzzling of the military, we know there was a great deal of hue and cry about this back in 1961 and 62. It seems that more and more military people are not speaking out today. The men in this American Security Council report are all retired generals and admirals. Where are the men who are on active duty? What are they saying about this? You mentioned that, of course, they're afraid of their careers.
Yes, the men on active duty are not saying very much, except, as I pointed out, the Joint Chiefs have come out for the building of the anti-missile, and they came out in the strongest language they could against the Moscow test ban treaty. Secretary McNamara's chief of public relations for a number of years was a man named Arthur Sylvester, who said, and I quote, "If you think any government official is going to tell you the truth, then you're stupid. Did you hear that? Stupid." End of quotation. So this is one reason why we have the credibility gap, especially in the area of defense.
I believe, Mr. Sylvester, in regard to that. We haven't really solved this question of megatonnage. I'm still very confused as to exactly what a megaton is again. You mentioned the Soviets had a 100-megaton bomb. I don't think we have anything near that size of a weapon.
Nothing. We haven't anything. We haven't tested anything anywhere near that size. A megaton is 1,000,000 tons of TNT, destructive power. It's almost beyond our imagination to imagine what destructive power this is. And that is why these multi-megaton bombs, particularly the 100-megaton bombs that we know the Soviets are building, have for the first time given an aggressor the capability of conquering the world. You know, you've had people who wanted to conquer the world before, but the oceans were too big and the armies were too small. But today, with these nuclear weapons, it can be done because they can wipe out a whole people in one attack.
Where do our missiles stand in position to our strength? We have the Polaris submarine missile. Isn't this as effective as a B-52 bomber or the so-called RS-70 bomber program?
Well, of course, the RS-70 is not being built under McNamara's policy. The Polaris weapon is something under 1 megaton. The B-52 can carry at least 40 megatons.
And they're phasing out the B-52.
Oh, yes, and McNamara has scrapped many of them already. He has announced that he's going to scrap 2/3 of those remaining. Over the total, you see, he has scrapped 3/4 of our strategic nuclear bombers.
What was the thing that frightened Khrushchev the most in Cuba in 1962? Was it our Polaris missiles?
No, it was our great Strategic Air Command that went on alert with the capability of delivering the 50,000 megatons of nuclear striking power.
The columnist William S. White wrote there's a real mystery in the meaning and implications for the West in the ouster of Nikita Khrushchev from power in the Soviet Union. What is the meaning of Mr. Khrushchev's ouster?
I was very interested that on that recent NBC television documentary on Khrushchev. They showed a lot of things, but they gave absolutely no explanation for why one day Khrushchev was accepting the adulation of thousands of Russians, and the next day he was out in his country place taking pictures of the birds and flowers. Now, I think that Admiral Ward and I offered the only explanation for the ouster of Khrushchev which has stood up in the light of subsequent events. We presented this at a time when the prevailing thinking was that Khrushchev had been ousted in a coup by his enemies, just as the normal coup that overthrows a dictator. We showed that it was a put-up job arranged by his own friends, Brezhnev and Kosygin, in order to put him off in a position of senior citizen and continue the Khrushchev policies without Khrushchev. We analyzed the Khrushchev strategy as the strategy for destroying the United States in a nuclear attack. And Khrushchev was a little lip-happy. He had let fall a number of incriminating revelations of this strategy. And I believe that the men in the Kremlin decided that by getting Khrushchev out of the way, they could continue this policy while making our State Department think that they were a new breed of communists in gray flannel suits who really wanted to have peaceful coexistence. Now, of course, Brezhnev is the Soviet space czar. He got to where he is because he developed this Soviet space program that we have seen on this chart has developed such tremendous Soviet destructive power. We see also, as a result of this NBC program, that Khrushchev is not in disgrace at all. He lives a very pleasant life with 2 cooks, 2 maids, 2 chauffeurs, 2 automobiles, a gardener, a country estate, a town apartment, all paid for by the state, plus a pension. Now, this is high living, and obviously he and his strategy and his accomplishments are held in high regard by the men in the Kremlin today. Now, the Khrushchev strategy, I think, was best summarized in that very interesting book called the Penkovsky Papers, which incidentally came out after Strike from Space and confirmed much of what we said. But Penkovsky, who had worked right in the Kremlin and defected to the West, said that the Khrushchev strategy was to bury the United States under a hailstorm of missiles.
And Oleg Penkovsky was a very high-ranking member of the Soviet military. He was also an intelligence officer, wasn't he?
Yes.
And he was attempting to inform the West of what Khrushchev was planning in his attempts to pass along information to our side.
And for a year and a half, he fed hundreds of secret Kremlin documents out to British and American authorities, and finally he paid with his life.
As I understand with my limited knowledge of nuclear questions, a missile fired from the Soviet Union, an intercontinental ballistic missile, would probably come down sometime in the United States within the period of about 30 minutes fired from the Soviet Union. But a missile fired from Cuba could arrive anywhere in the United States in a period of about 12 to 20 minutes. Now, is the purpose that Khrushchev sent missiles into Cuba in 1962 to get ahead of their timetable and attempt to attack and nuclearize the United States at that time?
That's absolutely right, just as you stated it, except that missiles coming from Cuba, I believe, could get here in 5 to 7 minutes. And as you see, this is essentially no warning. A missile fired from the Soviet Union would give us up to 30 minutes warning. A missile fired from Cuba would give us no warning. And in addition to that, they come in under our radar. You remember a few months ago there was some plane that came in from Cuba and landed, and nobody knew about it till it was on the airfield.
So you feel then that that Khrushchev may have been attempting a nuclear coup d'etat as early as 1962, and it simply fell through because of our intelligence?
It fell through because in the last nick of time we discovered it. Now, I think this is a very important point to explore because it shows the part that the American people have in this matter of defense. You remember back in 1962, as you pointed out, Senator Keating was saying on the floor of the Senate that the missiles were there. In addition to that, there were many Cuban refugees who told us about the missiles in Cuba. And really, I'll bet most of the people listening to this program knew there were missiles in Cuba before the State Department knew it. But you see, the State Department had made up its mind that we were in a new period of peaceful coexistence, and Khrushchev wouldn't do such a thing. And anyway, Gromyko had promised President Kennedy that he wouldn't do such a thing. So the State Department wouldn't believe the vast amount of evidence that it had. But that year, we were in a campaign year, and there was this rising tide of public opinion, that every time there was any kind of a political rally, you could feel this public opinion expressing itself, saying, do something about Cuba. And this revealed itself in letters to newspapers and letters to congressmen and so forth. And finally, in the last inch of time, the State Department thought, well, of course, there aren't any missiles in Cuba, but we better just make sure. So they sent the U-2 flight over, and the first U-2 photographed the missiles, and indeed they were there. Now, at that moment, our great Strategic Air Command went on alert, and we had the nuclear capability to protect ourselves. Now, once that element of surprise was removed, Khrushchev didn't go through with any plans that he had to attack the United States with nuclear weapons. And those weapons in Cuba, you know, they called them offensive weapons. But that was a very clever terminology.
No, they call them defensive weapons.
Well, no, ultimately the ones that they revealed were there were offensive weapons. And admittedly so. But they were really nuclear weapons which were capable of destroying about two-thirds of the United States. And so once the element of surprise was taken away, the Soviets wouldn't go ahead with any attack. They only attacked with the element of surprise. This is the typical communist tactic. And so fortunately, they were discovered in time. I think that every American citizen who participated in developing that public opinion that said do something about Cuba did a very constructive thing for the defense of our country and deserves credit for saving our country. Now we have the same situation right now. If a public opinion could articulate itself and say to Congress, we want you to vote the money for the Nike X anti-missile. We want to have an anti-missile system which will enable us to shoot down any enemy missiles coming our way. We don't want to rely on McNamara's judgment because we just don't have faith that he's got the Soviets numbered. We want to rely on the system that we know can shoot down the enemy missiles. We want to rebuild the nuclear strength of our country so that this great X, instead of bringing us down like this, will take a sharp turn and go back up so that we will have more than the Soviets.
The frightening thing to me is that we're fighting a bunch of 16-year-old pajama-clad kids in the jungle of South Vietnam, and we haven't yet gone up against the armies of mainland China or the Soviet Union, which possess somewhere in the neighborhood of about 450 divisions, and we only have 16 divisions in the American Army. And this is the only thing, this nuclear superiority that we once enjoyed was the only thing that saved us and kept us free. Churchill said as early as 1951, I think, that if it had not been for the American possession of the atomic bomb, the rest of Europe would be communized like Czechoslovakia, and London would be under bombardment. So this was the only thing that saved us. all these many years, and it is the only thing that will save us now, I believe, because we cannot go up man to man against the communist power blocks.
Right. We don't want to fight with the lives of fine American boys. We want to fight with the technology and with the wonderful weapons that America can produce. And I'm glad you mentioned Churchill, because he said, sometimes in the past we have committed the folly of throwing away our arms. Under the mercy of divine providence and at great cost, we have been able to rebuild our defense in time. But if we abandon our nuclear deterrent, there will be no second chance. This is the task we have before us today, and we must rebuild our nuclear deterrent in time.
I certainly hope that we do. My guest has been Mrs. Phyllis Schlafly, and I want to thank you very much for being here this evening.